Welcome to Ancient World's Sleep, where we drift back through forgotten evenings and half-remembered places, told slow and soft enough to carry you all the way into sleep. Tonight's story is a quiet one, about lamplight and snow and a promise kept for a stranger. So let yourself settle in and let it carry you away. Before we begin, take a moment just to arrive here. Wherever you are right now, let your body sink a little deeper into what's beneath you. Feel the mattress holding your weight, the way it's been holding the weight of tired bodies for as long as beds have existed. You don't have to hold yourself up anymore tonight. Let it take you. Notice your shoulders. They've probably been carrying something all day. A kind of quiet tension you didn't even notice creeping in. Let them drop, just slightly, away from your ears. Let them rest into the bed, heavy and unguarded. Feel the weight of the blanket over you, soft and familiar, like something settling rather than something covering. With every breath out, imagine a little more weight lifting away from you. Not the blanket, but everything else. The thoughts you were carrying, the things you were planning to do tomorrow, the small worries that followed you into the evening. Let them lift slowly, like mist rising off a field in the early morning. They'll still be there if you need them, but not tonight, not right now. Let your jaw soften. Let your hands go loose, fingers uncurling, palms turning slightly open, like they're finally allowed to stop holding on to anything. Take one slow breath in, and as you let it out, imagine the room around you growing a little dimmer, a little quieter, as if someone were turning a lamp down low, just for you. You don't need to do anything else right now. You don't need to follow every word. You can simply let your mind wander and let your body grow heavy and let the story do the rest. So settle in, get comfortable. And let's go back now to a small village in the hills where the houses leaned close together and every window held a little light against the dark. The village that keep the light on. If you're listening tonight, perhaps tucked beneath a blanket, perhaps with the soft hum of a fan somewhere in the room, or the distant sound of rain against a window, then allow yourself to settle in. There is nowhere else you need to be, nothing you need to solve, nothing you need to finish. The day can wait until tomorrow. For now, there is only this story, and a light in a window. A very small light. The sort of light most people would walk past without noticing. Yet sometimes, the smallest lights become the ones we remember the longest. So close your eyes if you'd like. Take a slow breath, and let me tell you about the village that kept the light on. My grandmother always began the same way. Every story had a beginning, of course. But hers were less like beginnings and more like returning to a place that had been patiently waiting. She would settle into a chair beside the fireplace. The chair itself seemed almost as old as she was. Its wooden arms had been polished smooth by decades of hands. The cushion had long ago lost its original shape and molded itself perfectly to hers. And once she was comfortable, she would glance toward whoever happened to be in the room. Sometimes it was me, sometimes my cousins, sometimes an unexpected visitor who had stayed after supper. Then she would smile, not a large smile, just enough to gather everyone's attention. And she would ask the question, "Did I ever tell you about the village that kept the light on?" The funny thing was that everyone knew she had, many times, dozens of times, perhaps hundreds. Yet nobody interrupted. Nobody said yes. Nobody complained, because hearing her tell it again never felt like repetition. It felt like being wrapped in a familiar blanket. The story changed slightly each time. A detail here, a memory there, a different pause, a different laugh, as though the story itself were alive, growing older alongside her. I remember one autumn evening especially. Outside, rain tapped gently against the windows. The kind of rain that arrives without drama. Not a storm, not a downpour, just steady drops falling from a gray sky. The fire crackled softly. A kettle hummed on the hearth. The scent of cedar smoke mixed with tea leaves and old books. I must have been 12 or 13, old enough to think I already knew every story she could tell, young enough to be completely wrong. When she asked the familiar question, I finally laughed. "Grandma," I said, "you've told us that one 100 times." She nodded. "I know. Then why do you keep asking?" For a moment she looked into the flames. The firelight danced across her face. The years seemed to soften. And when she spoke, her voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had spent a lifetime learning what mattered. Because stories aren't meant only for hearing. I frowned. That sounded impossible. What does that mean? She pointed toward the kettle. What is tea for? Drinking. Only drinking? I thought about it. No. What else? It's warm. She nodded. And blankets for sleeping. Only sleeping? No. What else? For comfort. Another nod. Then she looked at me. And stories? I was beginning to understand. A story can be comfort too. Exactly. She smiled. Some stories aren't told because someone needs information. She gestured toward all of us gathered around the room. They're told because people need reminding. Reminding of what? That they belong somewhere. Even now, many years later, I think about those words. That they belong somewhere. Perhaps that is why people return to old songs, why they reread favorite books, why certain smells can transport us decades into the past. The smell of bread, the scent of rain, wood smoke, apple pie cooling on a windowsill, a familiar voice. Some things do not exist merely to inform us. They exist to welcome us home. And so grandmother told the story again, the same way she always did, slowly, patiently, without rushing a single moment, because the village she spoke of was not a place anyone hurried through. It rested among hills, gentle hills, the kind that rise and fall like slow waves frozen in green earth, not mountains, not dramatic peaks crowned with snow, just rolling slopes that seemed content to spend their days beneath open skies. If you approached the village from the eastern road, you would first see the orchards. Rows of apple trees stretched across the hillside. In spring they blossomed white and pink, thousands upon thousands of flowers swaying in the breeze. From a distance, the orchards looked almost like clouds that had descended to rest upon the earth. The villagers often said that spring arrived first in the blossoms, before the calendar, before the weather, before people admitted winter was ending. The trees always knew. Bees drifted lazily among the flowers. Children ran between the rows. The air carried the sweet scent of petals and damp soil. And beneath it all was a feeling difficult to describe, a sense that life was quietly beginning again. Summer arrived slowly. Golden sunlight lingered across the hills. The evenings stretched long and peaceful. Grasshoppers chirped in tall grass. Laundry fluttered on clotheslines. The village square remained busy until nearly sunset. People lingered outside simply because the weather invited them to stay. Nobody seemed eager to go indoors. The houses themselves appeared almost golden beneath the summer light, built from pale stone gathered from nearby hillsides. They carried the marks of generations. Some walls leaned slightly. Some chimneys listed a few inches to one side. Windows had been repaired so many times that no two looked exactly alike, and yet together they formed something beautiful. Not because they were perfect, because they were lived in. Every doorstep had been crossed thousands of times. Every floorboard had learned the footsteps of families. Every window had watched seasons pass. When autumn arrived, the village transformed. Leaves painted the hillsides in shades of amber and crimson. Apple carts appeared in the marketplace. Wood smoke drifted from chimneys. The scent of cinnamon, baked bread, and drying leaves filled the air. Even sounds changed. The laughter of summer became quieter. Footsteps crunched softly across fallen leaves. Doors closed a little earlier. People spoke a little closer together. And then winter came. Winter always arrived differently than expected. Sometimes early, sometimes late. Sometimes in a single dramatic snowfall. Sometimes through weeks of growing cold. But eventually, frost appeared. Then ice. Then snow. The roofs turned white. The roads narrowed. The fields disappeared beneath blankets of silver. And yet the village remained warm. Not because winter was gentle, because the people knew how to meet it. Every chimney worked. Every cellar held food. Every neighbor checked on every other neighbor. And every evening, one light appeared in every window. Just one. Always one. Never more. Never less. No one could explain precisely when the tradition had begun. The oldest villagers claimed it existed before their grandparents were born. Their grandparents had said the same thing. Stories about its origin existed. Many stories. Too many, perhaps. One claimed a shepherd had once found his way home through a blizzard because of a single lamp. Another insisted the custom began after a terrible storm at sea. A third suggested it was older than the village itself, older than the church, older than the roads, older than memory. Nobody knew, nobody argued. The reason mattered less than the practice. The light remained. Every evening, without fail, a sunset painted the hills in fading gold. Windows awakened one by one. A glow here, a glow there. Another farther up the lane, another beyond the square. From the hilltops, the village resembled the constellations scattered across the earth, as though stars had drifted down from the heavens and decided to rest among the houses. Travelers noticed it immediately. Many stopped simply to stare. Some asked questions, others merely smiled, and the villagers always answered in much the same way. It's what we do. But there was one person who sometimes gave a different answer. An old woman named Maren. Everyone called her Old Maren. Not because she was frail, far from it. She walked more than people half her age. Her back remained straight. Her eyes remained sharp, and her memory was legendary. If someone forgot when a wedding happened, they asked Maren. If someone argued about the year a storm damaged the church roof, they asked Maren. If someone wanted to know who had lived in a certain house 50 years earlier, they asked Marin. And somehow she always knew. It was said she carried the village inside her mind. Every birth, every harvest, every celebration, every sorrow, all of it stored carefully away. And whenever travelers asked why the lamps were lit, Marin would smile and say something different. She would say, "The village is a promise." Then she would let the silence do the rest, because promises, she believed, were not things to explain too quickly. They were things to understand slowly, like seasons, like friendships, like the glow of a lamp seen from very far away. And in that village lived a little girl who would one day become my grandmother. At the time, she was only 9 years old. She lived in a stone house with blue shutters, a house perched near the western edge of the village where the evening sun lingered longest. From her bedroom window she could see the orchards. She could see the church steeple. She could see smoke rising from chimneys at supper time. And every evening, just before darkness settled across the valley, she performed a task that had belonged to her since her 7th birthday. A task involving a brass lamp, a dented brass lamp that her family trusted more than any other possession they owned. The lamp sat on a shelf beside the kitchen door. Its surface glowed warmly in firelight. Years of polishing had softened the metal to a rich golden shine, except for one small dent near the base. That dent had a story too. In the village, everything seemed to have a story. Even the objects, especially the objects, because things that remain long enough eventually collect memories, the way trees collect rings. The dent in the brass lamp had been there longer than my grandmother could remember. When she was very young, she assumed all lamps had dents. Children often believe the world has always existed exactly as they find it. The lamp was simply the lamp. The dent was simply the dent. And evening was simply the time when she filled it. Only later did she learn the story. Her grandfather had carried the lamp home during a winter storm many years before she was born. A horse had slipped on an icy road. A wagon wheel had struck a stone. The lamp had tumbled into a snowbank. When it was recovered, the dent remained. The damage could have been repaired. The village blacksmith offered several times, but grandmother's father always refused. "It's a trustworthy dent," he would say. Nobody knew exactly what that meant, yet everyone seemed to understand. The lamp had survived. The dent proved it. And in a village where storms mattered, survival earned respect. Every evening, shortly before sunset, the responsibility became hers. At 7 years old, she had been entrusted with the task, not because it was difficult, because it mattered. There is a difference. Children often know when adults are pretending something is important. This was not pretend. Her mother showed her carefully. The oil container remained on the lower shelf. The wick must be trimmed. The glass must be clean. The flame must be steady, not too high, not too low. And after the lamp was prepared, it would be carried to the front window. Always the same window, always the same place, always before darkness fully arrived. At first she treated it like any other chore, like sweeping, or carrying water, or gathering eggs. But over time she began to notice the way her mother watched. Not suspiciously, not critically, just attentively, as though the lesson extended beyond the lamp itself. One evening she finally asked, Why do you always watch?" Her mother smiled while folding laundry. "Because one day you'll do it without me." The answer puzzled her. She was only 8. The future felt unimaginably far away. Yet her mother spoke as though that future already existed, as though responsibility moved quietly from one generation to another, carried in small, ordinary actions, like filling a lamp, like setting a table, like remembering a promise. The years passed gently in that village, not because life was free from hardship, no village is, but because the rhythm of life remained steady, predictable, comforting. The seasons turned, the bells rang, the market gathered every Thursday, and each week seemed connected to the next by invisible threads. Market day was perhaps grandmother's favorite. Long before sunrise, wagons began arriving from neighboring farms. The roads filled with farmers, merchants, and traders. By morning, the square transformed completely. Canvas stalls appeared. Barrels rolled into place. Crates of vegetables lined the edges of the marketplace. Fresh apples, turnips, carrots, pears. Bundles of herbs tied meekly with twine. The baker arrived first most mornings, or so he claimed. The blacksmith disputed this regularly. The argument had continued for nearly 20 years. Nobody expected a resolution. Nobody wanted one. Some traditions survive precisely because they never reach an ending. The baker's stall smelled heavenly. Fresh bread, warm rolls, honey cakes, cinnamon pastries. Children drifted toward it as naturally as leaves drift toward streams. Grandmother was no exception. Many mornings she spent precious coins on pastries that disappeared before she reached home. Not because she intended to eat them, because they smelled too good to resist. The baker always pretended surprise. "Again?" he would say. "You've eaten your breakfast already?" She would nod solemnly. "Twice." Then he would laugh and slip an extra pastry into the bag. Years later she claimed he did this for every child. The children, meanwhile, each believed they were his favorite. Perhaps everyone was right. Market day sounded different too. Voices layered together. Laughter, conversation, the occasional bark of a dog, the creak of wagon wheels, the ringing of coins, the distant rhythm of the blacksmith's hammer, and somewhere above it all, church bells marking the passage of hours. There were wedding days too. Those were among the brightest days in the village. People decorated doorways with flowers. Ribbons appeared. Musicians emerged seemingly from nowhere. Tables filled with food. Children raced through crowds. Elders sat in shaded corners exchanging stories. And dancing continued long after sunset. Grandmother remembered one wedding especially, not because of the bride, not because of the groom, but because of what happened afterward. The celebration lasted until evening. Music drifted across the valley, lanterns glowed, guests lingered beneath the stars. Eventually, darkness arrived. The dancing slowed. People prepared to return home. And then, almost without thinking, everyone began lighting their windows, one by one, the same as every other night. The celebration did not replace the tradition. The tradition remained. Grandmother remembered noticing it for the first time. Even on the happiest night of the year, the lamps were lit. Always. She asked her father why. He looked surprised by the question. As opposed to what? as opposed to forgetting. He considered that, then shook his head. Promises matter most when life is busy. At the time, she did not fully understand. Years later, she would. The same thing happened during harvest. Harvest transformed the entire valley. The orchards became busy from dawn until dusk. Ladders leaned against trees, baskets filled with apples. Voices echoed across hillsides. The scent of fruit hung heavily in the air. Every available hand worked, children included. Especially children. Grandmother spent countless autumn afternoons carrying baskets that seemed far heavier than they should have been. By evening, her arms ached, her feet hurt, her clothes smelled of leaves and apples. Yet somehow, she loved those days. There was satisfaction in shared effort, in seeing rows of harvested fruit stretching across fields, in knowing winter would be fed, and even after exhausting days, when everyone returned home tired and hungry, the lamp still appeared. One window, one flame, one promise, always. Perhaps the moment that affected her most happened during a funeral. The village widow had lost her sister. The entire community gathered. The day felt quieter than usual. Footsteps softened, voices lowered. The church bell rang slowly. Clouds covered the sky. Even the wind seemed subdued. Grandmother remembered watching adults speak in hushed tones, watching neighbors bring food, watching grief move through the village like a shared burden. Afterward, people returned home. The day faded, evening approached, and as darkness settled, lights appeared in windows once more, not despite the sadness. Alongside it, the widow's lamp glowed, the baker's lamp glowed, the blacksmith's lamp glowed, her family's lamp glowed. All across the village, small flames pushed gently against the darkness. Nobody made speeches, nobody explained. The lights simply appeared, and somehow that felt important. Years later, Grandmother would say that was the first time she sensed the deeper meaning of the tradition. Not understood, sensed. Understanding came later. Some truths arrive gradually, like dawn. The widow fascinated her. Children often notice things adults overlook, and Grandmother noticed the widow's lamp seemed brighter than everyone else's. Objectively, it probably wasn't. But stories have a way of influencing perception. The widow lived alone near the edge of the village. Her house overlooked the western road, the road travelers used most often. Every evening her window shone warmly toward the hills. One afternoon, Grandmother finally asked why. "Why does your lamp look brighter?" The widow laughed softly. "It doesn't. It does. It only seems that way. Why?" The widow glanced toward the road. For a moment, her expression became distant, thoughtful. Then she answered, "Maybe because there's nobody here to keep it lit for except strangers." Grandmother frowned. The answer raised more questions than it solved. The widow noticed. Adults often underestimate how visible curiosity can be. "One day you'll understand." That seemed to be everyone's favorite explanation. "One day you'll understand." The phrase followed children everywhere. Yet in this case, they were right. She would understand. Just not yet. For now, life continued. Seasons passed. The lamp was filled. The window glowed. And every evening, as darkness spread across the valley, Grandmother loved watching the lights appear. Sometimes she stood at the front gate. Sometimes she watched from her bedroom. Sometimes from the orchard path. Wherever she happened to be, the effect remained magical. One window illuminated, then another, then another. A slow awakening, as though the village itself were breathing, as though the earth were exhaling stars. She once told me it looked like a constellation coming down to rest, not rising into the sky, descending from it, settling gently among chimneys and rooftops. And perhaps that image stayed with her because the lights always appeared so calmly. No rush, no drama, just certainty. The certainty that evening would come, the certainty that darkness would follow, and the certainty that somewhere behind every glowing window someone remembered. Old Marin certainly remembered. She remembered everything. And on certain evenings, when children gathered near her porch, she shared stories older than anyone else could recall. Stories about travelers, stories about storms, stories about lamps, stories that blurred the line between history and legend so completely that nobody could separate them anymore. Those were grandmother's favorite evenings of all, because old Moran knew stories hidden inside stories. And one autumn night, while leaves drifted across the lane and lantern light flickered beneath the harvest moon, Maran began telling the tale of another traveler. A traveler who had passed through the village many decades earlier. A traveler whose story, according to Maran, explained something important about why the lights remained. The children immediately leaned closer. Even the older ones, especially the older ones. There is a certain age when children begin pretending they are too grown for stories, yet somehow they always manage to stay within earshot. Grandmother sat cross-legged near the porch steps. A wool blanket rested around her shoulders. The evening carried that unmistakable autumn chill. Not cold enough to be uncomfortable, just cold enough to make warmth feel precious. A lantern hung beside Maran's door. Its amber glow illuminated drifting leaves as they crossed the lane. Some leaves caught the light briefly before continuing into darkness. Others gathered quietly along fences and stone walls. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke. Someone nearby was baking apples. And above the village, stars appeared one by one, almost as slowly as the lamps in the windows below. Marin waited until everyone settled. She had a storyteller's patience. The kind that understands silence is part of the story. Then she began. Long before any of you were born, Belle. The children exchanged glances. That, they knew, could mean almost any time at all. Long before your parents were born. She smiled. And before some of your grandparents were born too. A few of the children laughed. Marin's stories often seemed older than time itself. There was a traveler who came through these hills. Who was he? Someone asked. Marin shrugged. A traveler. The answer satisfied her completely. The children, less so. A merchant? Maybe. A soldier? Possibly. A thief? Marin raised an eyebrow. Perhaps. The children loved that answer. The mystery made the story larger somehow, as though the traveler could become whoever the listener imagined. One evening, Marin continued, he reached the ridge above the village. The same ridge? The very same. She pointed toward the dark silhouette of hills beyond the rooftops. The children turned instinctively. Even though darkness concealed most details, He had walked for many days. Was he tired? He was exhausted. Was he hungry? Very. Was he lost? Maren smiled. That depends on how you define lost. The children groaned. Adults loved answers like that. Maren continued. The traveler stood on the ridge and looked down. The lantern flickered softly beside her. The village glowed behind them. Golden windows scattered across the darkness. Below him, he saw lights. She pointed toward the houses. Just as you see now. The children looked. The lights seemed brighter when someone mentioned them. Perhaps imagination worked that way. He followed those lights into the village. Then what happened? He found supper. The children laughed. That's it? No. Maren smiled. That's where the story begins. Grandmother remembered that sentence for the rest of her life. That's where the story begins. Because most people assume stories begin with departures, or journeys, or storms, but often they begin with arrivals. Maren explained that the traveler stayed only one night. Yet, before leaving, he asked why every house displayed a lamp. The villagers answered as villagers always did. Because that's what we do. The traveler apparently found this frustrating. The children found it hilarious. Grandmother imagined him questioning every house in the village and receiving identical answers. Eventually, according to Maren, he asked an elderly farmer. Surely someone remembers the reason. The farmer thought for a while, then replied, Does a tree remember who planted it? The children fell quiet. Even they recognized that answer felt important. The traveler didn't understand. Neither do I, admitted one child. That's because you're still listening. Maren adjusted the blanket around her shoulders. Then she explained. The farmer told him, some things become so woven into daily life that their origins matter less than their continuation. The lantern crackled softly. A horse somewhere down the lane snorted in its sleep. The night settled deeper around them. The traveler eventually left, Maren said, but years later another traveler arrived, and another, and another. What happened to them? They found the lights. Simple, matter of fact, yet something about the answer lingered. Grandmother watched the lamps across the village. Their glow seemed softer now, deeper somehow. Not merely decoration, not merely habit, markers, signals, promises. The children continued asking questions, as children always do. But grandmother became distracted, not bored, thoughtful. She found herself imagining roads stretching beyond the hills, roads she had never walked, roads disappearing into forests and valleys and distant towns. She imagined strangers traveling those roads, people with names she would never know, people carrying worries, dreams, memories, people who might one day see the village lights from afar and feel something, hope perhaps, or relief, or simply curiosity. At 9 years old, she couldn't fully articulate the feeling, yet the thought remained with her. Long after the story ended, long after the children returned home, long after the lantern outside Maren's house was extinguished, that night she stood by her bedroom window. The village glowed beneath the stars. The lights reflected faintly in the glass. For the first time she wondered who might be seeing them from beyond the hills, and whether someone, somewhere, needed them. The question drifted through her thoughts for weeks afterward. Then, life continued, as life always does. School lessons, market days, orchard work, Sundays at church, winter approaching one careful step at a time. The first frost arrived late that year. Grandmother remembered waking one morning and finding silver patterns spread across the window pane. Delicate designs, intricate as lace. The sort of beauty winter creates without asking permission. She pressed her hand against the glass. Cold immediately greeted her palm. Outside, rooftops shimmered white. The village seemed transformed overnight. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys. The sky carried that pale winter brightness that arrives before sunrise. And somewhere downstairs, she could already hear her father moving through the kitchen. The familiar creak of floorboards, the clink of dishes, the ordinary sounds that make a house feel alive. Her father always woke first. Nobody knew exactly how early. Some suspected he never slept. Others believed he simply enjoyed quiet mornings. He possessed the kind of steadiness children notice even when they cannot describe it. Every day he followed nearly identical routines. Every day he repaired tools, tended fences, helped neighbors, carried firewood, filled feed buckets. And every evening, just before sunset, he glanced toward the brass lamp, not to check whether it had been prepared, to acknowledge it, almost like greeting an old friend. Grandmother once asked whether he worried she might forget. He shook his head. "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because someone trusted me with it." The answer puzzled her. Again, adults in the village seemed to specialize in answers that required years to understand. Winter deepened gradually. Snow arrived, then more snow. The roads narrowed. Trees stood bare against pale skies. The hills disappeared beneath blankets of white. Even sounds changed. Snow softened everything. Footsteps became muffled. Voices carried differently. The world seemed quieter, as though winter had placed a gentle hand over the valley. Yet despite the cold, the village remained busy. Life never stopped entirely. Children built snowmen. Farmers tended animals. The baker produced astonishing quantities of bread. And every evening, lamps appeared in windows, golden against blue darkness, warm against cold, predictable against uncertainty. Grandmother often watched from the front room, the brass lamp glowing beside her, its flame reflected in the glass. Outside, other lights awakened one after another, a familiar sequence, a comforting sequence, almost like listening to a favorite song. One evening she noticed the widow standing by her own window. Just for a moment, their eyes met across the lane. The widow smiled, then disappeared back inside. Yet her lamp remained, steady, bright, watching the road. The winter passed. Spring returned. Then summer. Then autumn once more. Years in childhood often seem endless while they are happening, yet later they feel astonishingly brief. Grandmother moved through them almost without noticing. 10 years old, then 11. The lamp remained. The village remained. The promise remained. And somewhere beyond the hills, roads continued carrying travelers toward destinations known only to themselves. Most passed nowhere near the village. A few stopped. Some stayed for supper. Others rested their horses. Many asked about the lights. Nearly all received the same answers. Because that's what we do. The village is a promise. The lamps stay lit. The explanations varied. The meaning remained. And then came the winter everyone remembered. Not immediately. Not at first. At first it seemed ordinary. The season arrived on schedule. The first snow fell gently. The orchards slept. The roofs turned white. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet old people began noticing small things. Old people often notice weather before weather arrives. A stiffness in joints. The behavior of birds. The feel of air before sunrise. Subtle clues invisible to everyone else. The blacksmith mentioned it first. The cold feels wrong. Nobody knew what he meant, including him. But he said it anyway. A week later, the baker agreed. Then a farmer. Then two more. No one could point to evidence. Only instinct. Only experience. The sort earned through decades, spent watching seasons. Grandmother overheard conversations she didn't fully understand. Adults discussing clouds, wind direction, pressure, road conditions, the possibility of heavier snow, the possibility of storms. Still, life continued, because life almost always continues right up until the moment circumstances change. The market opened, the church bell rang, children played, the lamps were lit, and far beyond the hills, many miles from the village, a lone traveler was beginning a journey that would eventually bring him toward them. Though neither he nor the villagers knew it yet. In fact, at that exact moment, he was walking along a narrow road, bordered by frozen fields, carrying everything he owned upon his back, completely unaware that somewhere ahead, hidden beyond forests and ridges and gathering clouds, a valley waited for him. A valley filled with lights. A valley keeping a promise. And before long, both the traveler and the village would find themselves moving toward the same winter night. At first, the traveler noticed nothing unusual. That is often how important nights begin. Not with warnings, not with music, not with dramatic signs written across the sky, but with ordinary moments, small moments. Moments so unremarkable that later, when people look back upon them, they struggle to believe they ever seemed ordinary at all. The traveler walked beneath a pale winter sun. The road stretched ahead in a long ribbon of frozen earth. Fields lay sleeping beneath frost. Bare trees stood quietly against the horizon. A thin layer of snow lingered in shaded places where sunlight rarely reached. His boots crunched steadily with each step, a sound that became almost hypnotic after enough hours. Crunch, step, crunch, step. The rhythm accompanied him through the day. He was neither young nor old, and depending on who later told the story, he became different people. Some insisted he was a peddler carrying goods between towns. Others swore he had once been a soldier. A few claimed he was a teacher. One version even suggested he had been a musician. Grandmother always liked that version. But the truth was that nobody knew. And perhaps nobody needed to know. Because some stories belong to a particular person. And some stories belong to anyone who has ever been alone. This was one of those stories. The traveler carried a worn pack. Its leather had faded from years of use. Its straps had been repaired more than once. The sort of bag that had accompanied him over many roads, many seasons, many miles. Inside were practical things. A spare shirt, a blanket, a small loaf of bread, a knife, A few letters folded carefully together. The letters mattered most. They always do. When people travel, it is often the smallest objects they protect most carefully. A photograph, a ring, a note written in familiar handwriting, proof that somewhere beyond the road a life exists waiting to be returned to. The traveler checked the letters several times each day, not because he feared losing them, because touching them reminded him where he was going, or perhaps who he hoped to become when he arrived. The sky remained clear through the morning. By afternoon, clouds began gathering along the horizon. Nothing alarming, just gray streaks drifting across pale blue, the sort of clouds most travelers would ignore. And he did. At least initially. He continued walking, passing frozen streams, crossing narrow bridges, following roads that wound between sleeping fields. Occasionally he encountered farmhouses, thin columns of chimney smoke rising into cold air. Sometimes dogs barked as he passed, sometimes children waved. Once, an old farmer offered him hot tea. The traveler accepted gratefully. The tea tasted of mint, and warmth, and kindness. Three things that often belong together. For a little while he sat beside the farmer's stove, watching flames dance behind iron doors, listening to the soft whistle of a kettle, feeling life return to cold fingers. When he eventually stood to leave, the farmer glanced toward the sky. His expression changed slightly. Not alarm, concern. "Storm coming." The traveler looked outside. Clouds had thickened. The light seemed dimmer. "Tonight?" The farmer nodded. Maybe. Such a small word, yet weather often hides inside words like that. The traveler thanked him and continued on. The road climbed gradually. Higher ground offered broader views of the countryside. Fields stretched toward distant hills. Forests darkened the horizon. The clouds continued gathering. The wind strengthened. Nothing dramatic, nothing immediate, just enough to encourage longer strides. As afternoon faded toward evening, he found himself thinking about home. Not the place he had left behind, the place he was heading toward. Home can mean either one, sometimes both. He imagined familiar faces, imagined arriving, imagined removing his boots beside a warm fire, imagined hearing his own name spoken by someone glad to see him. The thought made him smile. Roads are easier when they lead somewhere. The wind strengthened again. This time he noticed. Snow lifted from fields in thin drifting sheets. Clouds lowered. The sun disappeared entirely. The world became shades of gray. Gray sky, gray road, gray fields, gray distance. A flock of birds crossed overhead, moving quickly, purposefully, as though they knew something he didn't. The traveler adjusted his coat collar. Cold slipped beneath the fabric anyway. The first snowflakes arrived shortly afterward, small, sparse, almost delicate. A few landed upon his sleeve, then melted. Nothing concerning, nothing unusual. Yet within an hour, everything changed. The snow thickened, the wind accelerated, visibility shrank, landmarks blurred. The road became harder to distinguish from surrounding fields. The traveler pulled his scarf higher, lowered his head, kept walking. Because walking seemed sensible. Because stopping seemed foolish. Because storms often pass. And because human beings possess an extraordinary ability to believe the future will resemble the recent past. The storm had only begun. He did not know that. No one ever does. The wind roared across open ground. Snow raced through the air. The road vanished intermittently beneath drifting accumulation. The traveler squinted ahead, searching for fences, trees, anything, any feature capable of confirming direction. The landscape offered fewer answers with every passing minute. Cold found its way through gloves, through boots, through layers of clothing. Not suddenly, patiently. Winter rarely hurries. It simply persists. The traveler kept moving, one step, then another, then another. His world narrowed. No longer fields, no longer hills, no longer destination, only the next step, the next breath, the next moment. Snow collected upon his shoulders, upon his hat, along the edges of his scarf. Ice formed in his beard. His hands began losing sensation. Not completely, just enough to notice, enough to make him flex his fingers repeatedly. The movement hurt, which, strangely enough, felt reassuring. Pain meant feeling remained. The wind intensified again. This time, it howled. Not around him, through him. A deep sound rolling across empty land. Ancient, indifferent. The sort of sound that reminds people how small they are. He stopped briefly beside a fence post, a single weathered post emerging from swirling white. The fence itself disappeared beneath snow. He leaned against it, breathing hard. The storm swallowed every distant sound. No birds, no wagons, no voices, nothing. Only wind, only snow, only endless white movement. For the first time, uncertainty entered his thoughts. Not panic, not yet, just uncertainty. The uncomfortable realization that he no longer knew precisely where he was. The road should have reached a crossroads by now. Or perhaps it already had. He couldn't tell. Every direction appeared identical. Every field, every drift, every shadow. The world had become a blank page. He pushed onward, because motion still felt safer than stillness. The storm agreed with nothing. Not roads, not plans, not expectations. The storm simply existed, and he existed within it. Time became difficult to measure. Minutes stretched, distances distorted. He walked, and walked, and walked, and walked. At some point, twilight arrived, or perhaps it had already arrived earlier. The storm concealed the difference. The sky darkened gradually. Visibility shrank further. Snowflakes no longer appeared delicate. They struck his face sharply, driven by relentless wind. His legs felt heavier. His breathing became more difficult. Cold settled deeper into muscles, into bones, into thought itself. The traveler began remembering things, not intentionally. Memory often emerges during hardship, perhaps because the mind seeks warmth wherever it can find it. He remembered a kitchen, a wooden table, steam rising from soup, someone laughing, a dog sleeping beside a hearth. The memories appeared vividly, almost painfully vivid, more vivid than the storm, more vivid than the road. For a moment he could practically smell bread baking, could almost hear crackling firewood. Then the wind surged again. Reality returned. Cold, snow, darkness. The memory faded, leaving behind an ache he could not name. He checked the letters inside his coat. Still there, dry, safe. The gesture comforted him, only slightly, but slightly mattered. The storm continued, hour after hour, or what felt like hours. The traveler's thoughts slowed, not because he wanted them to, because exhaustion demanded it. Simple calculations became difficult. Direction became difficult. Even motivation became difficult. The dangerous part of severe cold is not merely the temperature, it is persuasion. Cold persuades. It whispers. It suggests. It encourages rest, just for a moment, just long enough. The traveler knew this, at least intellectually. He had heard stories. Everyone had. Travelers who sat down beside roads, people who closed their eyes briefly, people who intended only a short pause. The storm remembered them, others did not. So he continued walking, even when every muscle protested, even when his feet felt distant, even when darkness thickened around him. Then something happened, something small, something easy to miss. Far ahead, beyond curtains of snow, a light appeared. The traveler blinked. Once, twice, the light vanished, or seemed to. He stopped walking. The wind pushed against him immediately. Snow swirled past. He stared into the darkness. Nothing. Perhaps imagination. Exhaustion creates strange things. People see what they hope for, what they fear, what they need. He almost resumed walking. Then the light appeared again. Faint, golden, steady, far away, very far away, but unmistakably real. The traveler's heart quickened, not with certainty, with possibility. The smallest possibility, yet in difficult moments, possibility can feel enormous. He stared. The light flickered gently through drifting snow, then disappeared behind a gust, then returned, a single point of gold against endless winter darkness. One light, only one. But somewhere beyond the storm, gone, someone had lit a lamp. The traveler stood motionless for a moment, not because he wanted to stop, because hope itself can be startling when it arrives unexpectedly. A few moments earlier, the world had felt impossibly large, a wilderness of wind and snow, a place without edges, without direction, without certainty. And now there was a light, small, distant, fragile-looking, yet somehow stronger than the storm surrounding it. He narrowed his eyes. The wind threw curtains of snow across his vision. The light vanished, returned, vanished again. Each disappearance tightened something inside him. Each reappearance loosened it. The effect felt almost physical, like breathing after holding one's breath for too long. He took another step, then another. The light remained, far away, but present. And presence mattered, more than distance, more than certainty. The traveler focused on that single point of gold, not the storm, not the cold, not the miles he had already walked, only the light. Sometimes survival depends on reducing the world to one manageable thing, one step, one breath, one light. The wind continued its relentless song. Snow raced past. Darkness deepened. Yet the traveler found himself moving with slightly greater purpose. Not quickly. His body no longer possessed quickness, but steadily. The way rivers continue moving beneath winter ice. The way trees continue growing even when nobody notices. The light flickered again, and then something remarkable happened. A second light appeared, At first he thought it was a reflection, or perhaps exhaustion playing tricks on his eyes. He stopped, looked again. The first light remained, and beside it, farther to the left, another glow emerged, small, warm, steady. Two lights, separated by darkness, yet undeniably connected. The traveler frowned. A farmhouse, perhaps. Two neighboring homes. Possible? Reasonable. He continued walking. The snow shifted. The angle changed. The darkness thinned slightly. And then a third light appeared. Then a fourth. Then another. Not all at once. Gradually, patiently, as though the night itself were revealing them one by one. The traveler stared. For several seconds he forgot the cold entirely. Lights, not one, many, scattered across the darkness ahead, golden squares glowing through snow, some brighter, some dimmer, some appearing briefly before vanishing behind drifting curtains of white, yet together they formed a pattern, a shape, the suggestion of a place, a settlement, a village. His chest tightened with relief so sudden it almost hurt. Human beings, homes, warmth, shelter, the simple things that become extraordinary when threatened. He laughed once, a short, breathless sound immediately carried away by the wind. No one heard it, but hearing it himself helped, because laughter belongs to the living. The lights continued multiplying. The closer he came, the more appeared, like stars emerging after sunset, like constellations descending toward Earth. The storm still raged. The cold still bit through clothing. Yet something fundamental had changed. He was no longer wandering through emptiness. Somewhere ahead, people existed. People who knew nothing about him. People who had never spoken his name. People who did not know a traveler, struggled through the darkness toward them. And yet their lights were there, waiting. Not for him specifically, simply waiting. Miles away, within the village itself, evening had unfolded exactly as it always did. No alarms, no warnings, no sense that history was quietly approaching through the storm. Children finished supper. Dogs settled near fireplaces. Families closed shutters against the wind. The baker swept flour from his work table. The blacksmith banked the forge for the night. And in a stone house with blue shutters, an 11-year-old girl stood beside a brass lamp. "My grandmother!" She did not know the traveler existed. Not yet. At that moment, her thoughts concerned entirely different things. Whether school might close if snow continued, whether the baker's honey cakes truly tasted better than last year's, whether spring felt impossibly far away. The ordinary concerns of childhood. Outside, wind rattled the shutters. Inside, warmth gathered around the kitchen stove. Her mother kneaded bread. Her father repaired a wooden handle on one of the farm tools. The room smelled of yeast, wood smoke, and supper, the comforting scent of home. Grandmother lifted the oil container carefully. She had performed this task hundreds of times, yet she still approached it with concentration. Responsibility had become habit. Habit had become ritual. The brass lamp waited on the table, its familiar dent catching firelight, its polished surface glowing softly. She filled it, trimmed the wick, cleaned the glass, exactly as she had been taught, exactly as her mother had been taught, exactly as countless others before them. Then she carried it to the front window. Outside, snow rushed through darkness. Inside, a reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. For a moment she looked across the village. The storm blurred most details. Yet she could still see other lamps appearing. One here, another there, small islands of gold in a sea of winter night. The sight always pleased her. She never grew tired of it. Even now, decades later, when she told me the story, she could still describe that exact evening. The glow, the snow, the reflection of flame dancing against the window pane. She set the lamp down, adjusted it slightly, then stepped back. The ritual complete. Elsewhere, the widow was doing the same thing. Her house stood near the western road, closer than most to the edge of the village, closer than most to the storm. She moved slowly these days, not weakly, simply carefully. Age teaches economy of motion. She filled her lamp, lit the wick, carried it to the familiar window, the same window she had used for years, the same window overlooking the same road where travelers occasionally appeared, though not often during winter. Certainly not during storms. She placed the lamp upon the sill. The golden glow spread across the glass, warm against cold darkness. Then she drew the curtains only partially, never fully, never enough to hide the light. The road remained visible, as it always had, as it always would. She stood there briefly, watching snow sweep across the landscape. The storm had worsened. Even she could see that. Yet eventually she turned away. There was tea to make, a book to finish, an evening to spend. The lamp remained behind, watching, waiting, steady. Far beyond the village, the traveler continued struggling forward. The lights seemed closer now, though distance becomes deceptive in storms. The road, if he was still on it, curved gradually downhill. The wind shifted. For a few precious moments, snowfall lessened, and the village appeared. Not clearly, not fully, but enough. Enough to reveal rooftops, enough to reveal chimneys, enough to reveal dozens of glowing windows scattered across the valley. The sight struck him with unexpected force, not merely because it promised shelter, because it looked beautiful. There are moments when exhaustion strips life down to essentials, and beauty, surprisingly, often survives the process. The traveler had spent hours surrounded by cold indifference. Now he saw evidence of care. Every light represented effort. Someone had filled that lamp. Someone had trimmed that wick. Someone had chosen to push back darkness. Again and again, night after night. The realization touched something deep within him, though he could not have explained why. The wind returned. Visibility vanished. The village disappeared once more. But now he knew it existed. That changed everything. He kept moving, downhill, toward the lights, toward warmth, toward people. His legs trembled, his hands felt distant, his face burned with cold. Yet he continued. One step, one breath, one light after another guiding him forward. Eventually, fences emerged from the storm, then stone walls, then the dark outline of an orchard sleeping beneath snow. The traveler nearly cried from relief. Civilization, near, real, reachable. The lights appeared larger now, no longer stars, now windows, actual homes. He could almost imagine the rooms behind them, families eating supper, children listening to stories, people unaware that a stranger approached through the night. The thought comforted him. Normal life continued. The world remained intact. The storm had not swallowed everything. The road narrowed, then widened, then became a lane bordered by stone walls. Snow drifted heavily along its edges, but the way forward remained visible. Barely. Enough. The traveler followed it. A dog barked somewhere ahead. The sound startled him, then made him smile. A barking dog meant a house. A house meant people. People meant fire. The bark came again, closer this time, followed by another. Then silence. The village was near, very near. His pace quickened instinctively. Not much. His body had little left to give, yet hope provided strength that exhaustion could not entirely erase. The lane curved, the lights expanded, and then he saw them clearly for the first time, a line of glowing windows stretching through the storm, golden rectangles scattered along the road, one after another, one after another, one after another. Not random, not accidental. Together they formed something remarkable, a boundary, a guide, a pathway, almost like a fence built from light itself. The traveler stopped, only briefly. The sight was astonishing. In all his years of wandering, he had never seen anything quite like it. The village seemed less constructed than illuminated, less discovered than welcomed. The lights did not merely exist within the darkness. They answered it, quietly, patiently, without struggle, without fear. The storm raged around them. The lamps burned anyway, and standing there, snow-covered and exhausted, the traveler felt something he had not felt in many hours. Safe, not completely, not yet, but close enough to taste, close enough to believe, close enough to continue. He followed the nearest light, a warm glow shining from a house near the edge of the village. The widow's house. The lamp in her window burned steadily, unaware of the role it was about to play. The traveler reached the gate. His hands barely obeyed him now. His thoughts felt slow, heavy, like wheels turning through deep snow. Yet somehow he managed to cross the yard, reach the porch, climb the steps. The golden light spilled across the snow around him. For the first time all evening, he could feel genuine warmth through the window glass. Only a little, but enough to remind him what warmth felt like. He raised a trembling hand and knocked on the door. The sound was surprisingly soft, not the firm knock he intended, not the confident announcement of a traveler arriving at a welcoming home, more a gentle tapping, the sort of sound that might easily be mistaken for a branch brushing against wood in the wind. For a moment, he wondered whether anyone inside had heard it. The storm certainly hadn't. The wind continued roaring around the house. Snow swept across the porch. Darkness pressed against every side of the little pool of golden light. The traveler leaned one hand against the doorframe. His legs felt unreliable. His thoughts seemed to drift in and out like distant tides. Part of him wanted to knock again. Another part simply wanted to rest. Just for a moment, just long enough to catch his breath. That thought frightened him, because somewhere beneath the exhaustion he recognized it. The dangerous invitation of cold. The whisper that said resting and stopping were the same thing. The whisper that said tomorrow would be easier. The whisper that had convinced many travelers to sit down and never rise again. So he straightened, or tried to. and raised his hand once more. Before his knuckles touched the wood, the latch turned. The door opened. Warmth immediately spilled into the night. Not dramatic warmth, not a blast, just a gentle wave. The kind of warmth that belongs to kitchens, to firelit rooms, to places where people have been living ordinary lives. The traveler inhaled instinctively. Wood smoke, tea, bread, a faint trace of lavender. The scents reached him all at once, and suddenly, unexpectedly, his eyes filled with tears. The widow stood in the doorway. A small woman wrapped in a dark wool shawl, silver hair pinned neatly back, one hand still resting on the latch. For several seconds neither of them spoke. The traveler must have looked terrible. Snow covered his shoulders, ice clung to his clothing. His face was pale beneath the cold, his expression vacant with exhaustion. Yet the widow showed no surprise, no alarm, no suspicion, no hesitation, only recognition. Not recognition of him, recognition of the situation, as though she had always understood that someday someone might appear, and if they did, the response was obvious. The traveler opened his mouth, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to explain, perhaps to ask permission. No words emerged. The widow saved him the effort. She stepped aside and said simply, "Come in." The traveler crossed a threshold. The moment he entered, the storm seemed to retreat, not disappear. It still rattled windows, still moaned around corners of the house, still hurled snow against the walls. But now it existed outside. Outside mattered less. The widow closed the door. The latch clicked softly. Such a small sound! Yet to the traveler it felt enormous, a boundary, a line between danger and safety. He stood uncertainly on the rug. Snow melted from his boots. Water pooled beneath him. The widow noticed. She noticed everything. Without comment, she fetched a towel, then another, then motioned toward a chair beside the fire. The traveler sat, or rather collapsed carefully. The chair welcomed him. The fire welcomed him. The room welcomed him. For several moments, neither spoke. The widow busied herself with practical things. More wood on the fire, a kettle repositioned, a blanket retrieved from another room. Experienced kindness often moves this way, not through speeches, through actions. The traveler wrapped trembling hands around a mug of tea she eventually placed before him. The ceramic felt wonderfully warm, almost too warm. His fingers tingled painfully as sensation began returning. The widow settled into a chair opposite him. The fire crackled softly between them. At last she spoke. "You came through the Western Road?" It wasn't a question. The traveler nodded. "I think." The widow smiled slightly. "Then you definitely came through the Western Road." Her certainty felt comforting, as though somebody in the room understood what was happening. The traveler looked toward the window. The lamp still glowed on the sill, golden against the storm. Its reflection shimmered faintly in the glass. For a moment he stared at it. Then he asked the question that had been forming since he first saw the light. "Was that your lamp?" The widow followed his gaze. "Yes." The traveler nodded slowly. "I saw it from the hills." "Did you?" Her tone carried neither surprise nor pride, only quiet interest. "It helped me find the village." The widow looked at the lamp for several seconds, then back at him, and with complete sincerity she said, "I kept it lit for you." The traveler blinked. The answer puzzled him. How could she have known? How could anyone have known? The widow noticed the confusion immediately. A smile touched her face, the sort of smile people wear when they've answered a question correctly but incompletely. No, she said gently, not specifically for you. The traveler waited. The fire popped softly. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the room remained warm. The widow folded her hands. Then she explained. I kept it lit in case. The traveler looked toward the window again. The lamp burned steadily. Its flame neither dramatic nor large, yet somehow the room seemed arranged around it, as though everything else existed second. In case of what? He asked. In case someone needed it. The answer arrived so naturally she seemed surprised he had to ask. The traveler frowned. You leave it there every night? Every night, even during storms. Especially during storms. The widow sipped her tea. The traveler considered this. Somewhere in the house, a clock ticked quietly. The fire settled lower. Wind rattled the shutters. You don't know who might come. No, you don't know if anyone will. No. Then why do it? The widow's eyes drifted briefly toward the lamp, then toward the darkness beyond the glass. Finally she answered, because one day somebody might. The traveler followed her gaze. Outside, snow continued falling. The world remained harsh and cold. Yet here he sat, alive, warm, because someone had prepared for a stranger. Prepared without expectation, without certainty, without reward. The realization settled over him slowly, like snow settling over fields. The widow stood. You need food. The traveler suddenly realized she was right. His hunger arrived all at once, the kind that appears after danger passes. The widow moved about the kitchen. Soup warmed on the stove. Bread emerged from a cupboard. Butter appeared. Then cheese. Simple food, wonderful food. The traveler ate carefully at first, then hungrily. Then with the quiet embarrassment of someone realizing how hungry he truly is. The widow pretended not to notice. Good hosts often possess that skill, the ability to preserve dignity while offering help. When the meal ended, she prepared a bed in the small spare room. Nothing elaborate. A narrow mattress, heavy quilts, a wash basin, a chair, a tiny window overlooking the road. The traveler looked at it as though she had offered him a palace. Thank you. The widow nodded. As long as you need. The traveler intended to answer. Instead, exhaustion overtook him. The room tilted slightly, not from illness, from relief. The widow smiled. Sleep first. The traveler obeyed. Because some advice is impossible to argue with. Within minutes, he was asleep, deeply asleep. The sort of sleep that arrives only after hardship. The sort of sleep where the body finally believes it has permission to stop fighting. Outside, the storm continued through the night. Snow piled against fences, wind crossed rooftops, branches creaked, roads disappeared beneath drifts. Yet inside the widow's house, everything remained warm. The lamp continued burning in the window, steady, patient, golden. And all across the village, other lamps burned too. One in the baker's window, one in the blacksmith's, one in old Maren's, one in the house with blue shutters where my grandmother slept soundly beneath thick blankets. The village glowed through the darkness. A constellation brought down to earth, a promise shining against the storm. Morning arrived slowly. Winter mornings often do. The darkness softened. Gray light filtered through clouds. The wind weakened. Snowfall diminished. The traveler woke confused. For several moments he did not remember where he was. The room unfamiliar. The quilt unfamiliar. The silence unfamiliar. Then memory returned. The storm. The lights. The widow. The lamp. Relief followed immediately. He was safe. He sat up. The room felt wonderfully warm. Sunlight, what little managed through the clouds, illuminated drifting dust motes. The house creaked softly around him. Somewhere downstairs he heard movement. The gentle sounds of someone preparing breakfast. A kettle, a cupboard, footsteps, ordinary sounds, extraordinary sounds. Because they meant life continued. The traveler dressed. Slowly, his muscles ached. His hands remained stiff, but warmth had returned. Strength, too, at least some of it. When he entered the kitchen, the widow was already awake. Naturally. People like her always seem awake before everyone else. A plate awaited him. Bread, eggs, jam, tea. The traveler stared at it, then at her, then back at the food. Something shifted in his expression, something the widow noticed immediately. His eyes filled unexpectedly, not dramatically, not with sobbing, just sudden tears, the kind that arrive when relief finally catches up to a person. The kind that appear after danger has passed and the body realizes survival is no longer theoretical. It's real. The traveler looked down quickly. Embarrassed, the widow pretended not to notice. Then, after a respectful silence, she said softly, "It usually happens on the second morning." The traveler glanced up. "What does?" The widow smiled. "The crying." And somehow that simple sentence made him laugh through the tears. Because she said it with such certainty, as though travelers arriving half-frozen from storms were a perfectly ordinary occurrence, as though human hearts always behaved in predictable ways. Perhaps, in some respects, they do. The traveler sat. The widow poured tea. Outside, sunlight touched the snow, and across the village, word had already begun spreading. A stranger had arrived during the storm, which meant before noon, visitors would start appearing at the door. That was simply how villages worked. News traveled faster than weather, faster than horses, faster than common sense. By the time the traveler finished breakfast, half the village probably knew someone had arrived through the storm. By lunchtime, the other half would know as well, not because people were gossiping, or at least not entirely because people were gossiping, rather because small communities possess a particular kind of curiosity, a curiosity rooted less in judgment and more in concern. People wanted to know whether the stranger was well, whether he needed anything, whether the storm had been worse beyond the hills, whether roads remained passable, whether anyone else might still be out there. The traveler had barely finished his second cup of tea when the first knock arrived. 3 gentle taps. The widow smiled before opening the door, as though she had been expecting it. Perhaps she had. Standing outside was the baker, a scarf wrapped around his neck, snow clinging to his boots, and beneath one arm a basket. Of course, the baker never arrived empty-handed. That would have violated some unwritten law of baking. "Morning," he said. Then he noticed the traveler. "Ah!" The baker nodded. "So you're the storm." The traveler blinked. "The storm?" The baker stepped inside. "Yes." He placed the basket on the table. "Everyone's been talking about a stranger arriving during the night." The baker studied him thoughtfully. "You seem smaller than expected." The traveler laughed despite himself. The widow rolled her eyes. The baker grinned. The ice was broken. Inside the basket were fresh rolls, still warm. The scent filled the room instantly. The traveler could hardly believe such things existed. Warm bread, a warm room, friendly conversation. Only yesterday these things had seemed impossibly distant. The baker stayed for nearly an hour. Most of that time was spent discussing weather. Villagers take weather seriously, particularly after storms. Every drift, every fallen branch, every blocked road, all worthy of detailed examination. The traveler contributed what information he could. The baker contributed considerably more. Then another knock came, and another. By afternoon, a small parade of villagers had visited. Some brought food, some brought blankets. One brought a pair of dry gloves. Another delivered preserves. Someone else arrived carrying firewood, despite the widow already possessing plenty. The traveler tried repeatedly to explain that he needed nothing. This achieved very little. Villagers often regard statements like, "I need nothing," as invitations to provide additional things. The blacksmith arrived shortly after midday. He filled the doorway almost entirely. Broad shoulders, large hands, a face permanently shaped by years spent near heat and metal. The traveler expected intimidating conversation. Instead, the blacksmith handed him a small carved wooden horse. The traveler stared at it. "What's this?" The blacksmith shrugged. "I carve when it snows." The answer seemed complete from his perspective. The traveler examined the little horse. Its craftsmanship was remarkable. Tiny details, carefully shaped curves, a smooth, polished finish. "You made this." "Couldn't sleep." The blacksmith sounded mildly embarrassed. Then he cleared his throat. "Anyway." Another shrug. "Welcome." The traveler thanked him. The blacksmith nodded once, then spent 15 minutes discussing fence repairs before departing. Every visitor carried a similar quality. None treated him like a spectacle. None interrogated him. None demanded explanations. Instead, they simply included him, as naturally as adding another chair to a table. The effect felt strangely moving. Perhaps because inclusion is most noticeable when unexpected. Perhaps because loneliness and belonging often reveal themselves through small gestures. Or perhaps because the traveler had spent so long on roads that he had forgotten what community felt like. By evening, the house seemed fuller somehow, not physically, emotionally. The widow's table contained gifts, bread, jam, wood carvings, preserves, a knitted scarf someone insisted he take. The traveler stared at the collection. "Do they do this for everyone?" The widow looked genuinely puzzled. "Of course." The traveler shook his head slowly. "No." He smiled. "I mean, really?" The widow considered the question, then nodded. "Really?" The traveler glanced toward the window. The lamp had already been lit. Darkness gathered outside. Snow reflected moonlight across the road. Other windows glowed throughout the village. Steady, warm, familiar. The traveler found himself watching them for a long time. The widow noticed. She noticed most things. Beautiful, aren't they? The traveler nodded. Yes. For several moments neither spoke. Then the widow asked, What did you think when you first saw them? The traveler smiled faintly. I thought I was imagining them. The widow laughed. A reasonable assumption. I saw one light first. His eyes drifted toward the glass, then another, and another. The widow nodded knowingly. That happens. The traveler looked at her. Why does it feel different? What does? The lights. The widow thought for a moment, then answered carefully. Because they aren't trying to impress anyone. The traveler considered that. The widow continued. So many things in the world demand attention. She gestured vaguely. Signs, announcements, grand gestures. Her gaze returned to the lamp. But a lamp simply waits. The room fell quiet. The traveler watched the flame, steady, patient, unconcerned with recognition. Perhaps that was part of its power. The next morning brought clearer skies. Sunlight sparkled across fresh snow. Icicles hung from rooftops. The village seemed transformed, as though the storm had polished everything overnight. The traveler felt stronger, not fully recovered, but stronger, enough to walk outside, enough to explore. The widow lent him a thicker coat, ignoring his attempts to refuse. The village greeted him warmly, not dramatically, simply warmly. People nodded, smiled, waved. Children followed him briefly before becoming distracted by other things. The baker insisted he sample fresh pastries. The blacksmith insisted he inspect a repaired wagon wheel. A farmer insisted he admire a particularly impressive goat. The traveler complied with all three, because refusing seemed impossible, and because, strangely enough, he enjoyed it. There is comfort in ordinary life, particularly after danger. The village possessed ordinary life in abundance. He walked narrow lanes, passed stone houses, watched smoke rise from chimneys, listened to church bells, observed children dragging sleds through snow. Everywhere he looked, evidence of continuity surrounded him. The village had existed yesterday. It existed today. It would exist tomorrow. Such certainty felt rare. Toward afternoon, he found himself standing outside old Miren's house. He recognized her immediately. Some people possess an unmistakable presence. Age seemed woven into her the way grain is woven into wood, not weakness, history. Miren sat upon her porch despite the cold, wrapped in blankets, watching the village, watching everything. The traveler approached. Miren looked up. Her eyes were sharp as winter sunlight. So, the word carried amusement. You found the lights. The traveler smiled. I suppose I did. Miren nodded. As intended. He sat beside her. The village stretched below. Golden afternoon sunlight reflected from snow-covered rooftops. For a while, they simply watched. The traveler found the silence comfortable. Miren seemed entirely content with it. Eventually he asked, How old is the tradition? Miren smiled immediately, as though she had been waiting. Which answer would you like? The traveler laughed. The true one. Ah. Miren folded her hands. The difficult answer. She looked toward the village, toward the windows that would glow again when evening arrived. Then she began. Most people think traditions begin with decisions. The traveler listened. They imagine a meeting. A small smile touched her face. A declaration. She shook her head. Usually they're wrong. The traveler nodded. Marin continued. Most traditions begin with a single act. The winter sun rested upon the snow. The village seemed almost luminous. One person helps another. Marin's voice softened. Then someone remembers. The traveler glanced toward her. And that's how this began. Perhaps. The answer carried certainty and uncertainty simultaneously. Marin seemed to enjoy that. She settled deeper into her blankets, then began telling a story. A story older than anyone could verify, older than records, older than certainty. A story carried through generations, about a winter long ago, a winter harsher than any living person remembered, a winter when roads vanished, when supplies ran low, when storms arrived one after another without pause. During that winter, according to Marin, a woman waited for her son to return home. Every evening she lit a lamp. Not unusual. People needed light, but she placed hers in the window, facing the road, waiting. The sun never arrived that winter, or the next, or perhaps he did. The story changed depending on who told it. Marin didn't seem concerned by the contradictions, because the sun wasn't the point. The lamp was. The woman continued lighting it, night after night. Then one evening a traveler arrived. Not the sun, someone else, lost, cold, exhausted. The traveler saw the lamp, followed it, survived. The woman fed him, sheltered him, and afterward another family began leaving a lamp in their window too. Then another, and another. Not because they expected someone, because they understood someone might come. Marin paused. A breeze stirred snow from a nearby roof. Tiny crystals sparkled through sunlight. The traveler waited. The thing people misunderstand, Marin said eventually, is that the lamp was never about certainty. Her gaze remained fixed upon the village. It was always about possibility. The traveler felt something settle inside him, some understanding difficult to describe. Marin continued quietly. The woman couldn't know who would need the light. No, she couldn't know whether anyone would.
No, yet she lit it anyway.
The traveler looked across the valley, at houses, at roads, at ordinary lives unfolding beneath winter skies. And for the first time, he began understanding what the village truly protected. Not a tradition, not a custom, a way of seeing other people, a belief that kindness need not wait for certainty, that care need not require guarantees, that a light could be left burning simply because someone, somewhere, might need help finding their way home. And as evening slowly approached, villagers began preparing their lamps once more. The traveler noticed it everywhere. Once he was looking for it, he could not stop seeing it. A woman returning from the market paused to trim a wick. A farmer carried a small oil container beneath one arm as naturally as carrying bread. Children were sent to fetch matches. Curtains were adjusted. Glass chimneys were cleaned. Small, ordinary actions repeated throughout the village. None dramatic, none ceremonial. And yet, together, they formed something larger than any one person. The traveler found himself thinking about rivers. how a river is not created by one drop of water, or one stream, or one spring. It is created by countless small contributions moving in the same direction. The lamps felt similar. One lamp alone was comforting. Many lamps together became something else entirely. A statement, a promise, a welcome. The sun drifted lower. Shadows stretched across the snow. The sky softened from pale blue into gold, then amber, then rose. The traveler stood near the edge of the village and watched evening arrive. It happened gradually, almost invisibly, until suddenly the first lamp appeared. Then another. Then another. Golden windows awakening throughout the valley, just as they had on the night he arrived, just as they had for years before that. The sight moved him more now than it had before, because now he understood, or at least understood a little more than he had. The widow's lamp appeared among the first, steady, warm, faithful. The traveler smiled, then began walking back toward her house. The third evening felt different, not because anything extraordinary happened, because ordinary things had become meaningful. He helped carry firewood. He repaired a loose hinge on the garden gate. He shared supper with the widow. They spoke about roads, books, weather, childhood memories, people they had known. The kind of conversation that unfolds naturally when nobody is trying to impress anyone. Outside, darkness settled over the village. Inside, the lamp glowed in the window. The traveler found himself glancing toward it repeatedly. Eventually, the widow noticed. Again.
She always noticed. You keep looking at it.
The traveler smiled sheepishly.
I know.
What are you thinking? He considered the question, then answered honestly. I'm thinking about how strange it is. The lamp, the whole thing. The widow waited. The fact that none of you knew I existed. No, and yet the lights were there. The widow nodded. Yes. The traveler stared into the fire. Orange light flickered across the room.
I think that's what surprises me.
The widow's expression softened. Most people expect kindness to be personal. The traveler looked up. She continued. They expect it to begin after someone is known. The fire crackled quietly. But sometimes kindness begins long before introductions. The traveler sat with those words. Long after the conversation moved elsewhere, long after tea had been poured, long after the evening deepened, the next morning dawned bright and clear. The storm was gone, completely gone. The sky stretched blue and endless above the valley. Sunlight glittered across untouched snow. The world looked renewed. The traveler stood outside the widow's house and breathed deeply. The air was cold, clean, sharp, the sort of winter air that feels almost transparent. For the first time since arriving, he knew it was time to leave, not because he wanted to, because journeys eventually continue. Roads call people onward. Even good places cannot become permanent resting places for every traveler who passes through. The realization brought an unexpected sadness. 3 days. Only 3 days. Yet something within him had shifted. The village felt strangely familiar now. The lanes, the houses, the people, the lights. He knew the baker's laugh, the blacksmith's quiet humor, old Maren's patient wisdom, the widow's calm certainty. Leaving felt harder than expected. The widow seemed unsurprised. She watched him pack, watched him fold blankets, watched him prepare his belongings. The letters returned safely to his bag. His coat was dry, his boots repaired, his strength restored. At last, everything was ready. The traveler reached into his pack, then paused, then reached deeper. Eventually, he produced a small leather pouch. The widow immediately shook her head.
No.
The traveler laughed. You don't even know what I was going to say. I do. The traveler held up the pouch. Please. No, you saved my life. The widow looked genuinely puzzled, as though he had stated something obvious and therefore unnecessary.
You needed help.
Yes.
And I helped.
Yes. She spread her hands slightly.
There, finished.
The traveler smiled, despite himself.
It doesn't work that way.
The widow raised an eyebrow. Why not? The traveler opened his mouth, then closed it again.
Because he wasn't entirely sure.
The widow smiled. Exactly. Some things refuse to become transactions. Some things lose meaning when reduced to exchange. Eventually, the traveler returned the pouch to his bag. The widow nodded approvingly. A matter settled. Or so he thought. Because after a moment she spoke again. There is something you can do. The traveler looked up immediately. Anything. The widow considered him carefully, as though weighing the request before offering it. Then she nodded toward the lamp, the same lamp that had guided him through the storm. The same lamp glowing quietly in the window even now. The same lamp he had spent 3 days watching. Light a window. The traveler blinked. What? Wherever you end up. She spoke gently, matter-of-factly, as though asking him to mail a letter or water a garden. Light a window. The traveler looked at the lamp, then back at her. That's all? That's all. The traveler frowned slightly. The request seemed too small, too simple. The widow noticed. Again.
Always. Once you've been the traveler,
she said softly,
you understand the lamp differently.
Silence settled between them. Outside, sunlight sparkled across snow. The village continued its ordinary morning. The traveler looked toward the road, then toward the lamp, then toward the widow. And slowly he nodded.
I will.
The widow smiled,
satisfied.
Not because she believed he would keep the promise, because she believed he understood it. There is a difference. A promise made without understanding is fragile. A promise rooted in experience tends to endure. The traveler shouldered his pack. The familiar weight settled across his back. The road waited. The village waited too, not to stop him, to send him onward. The widow walked him to the gate. The snow crunched beneath their boots. The sky stretched endlessly above. At the gate, he stopped, turned, looked once more at the house. The lamp remained visible through the front window, even in daylight. A small golden shape, patient, steady, waiting for evening. The traveler felt suddenly emotional, not dramatically, just quietly. The way people often feel when leaving places.